So I really basically tonight would like to show you a film which actually was shown to some of you in our last session last year when I was still in the process of making it. And I remember you were very enthusiastic about it, and I was greatly heartened. And we went on to complete it. Maybe I ought to say some things about it, first of all. I believe that opera cannot be filmed. There is something about the idea of one continuous long wide shot with no cuts, no interruptions, in order a particular experience. I mean, let's forget for the moment the question of live music and the question of scale, but the whole phenomenon of watching an opera is one single long wide shot. The, I suppose, frustration, because certainly in old opera houses in front of you, put a penny in the shot, you could get a pair of opera glasses, so everybody would be looking in this peculiar demand for close-ups. Many, many films have been made, of course, about opera, about operas. Not that I can think of any of them which I would particularly say was a good transference of the operatic experience back onto film again. As soon as you make a cut, of course, you interrupt the continuity, you interrupt the attention span, you throw, in a sense, you break the membrane of that particular relationship that the audience has with this one continuous wide shot. About 6 years ago in Amsterdam, I was commissioned to make an opera of my own choice with the National Opera Company. Amsterdam, not particularly well endowed with a history of music. I would actually challenge anybody in this room to name me a famous Dutch composer. There was one gentleman around about the 1780s, a man called Schwelinck, who actually wrote most of his material also in German. But he was sort of the basis, I suppose, of contemporary Dutch ideas about having a sense of Dutch musicianship. But currently, I suppose, the country is quite well endowed by a gentleman called Louis Andriessen, who is regarded as Holland's foremost avant-garde composer. He had seen some of my movies many, many years ago, and we came together over a BBC production where the BBC had commissioned, at the time of the duocentenary of Mozart's death, the possibility of 5 European composers collaborating with directors of their choice to make some homage, some, I suppose, you could hardly call it. It didn't really have much to do with appreciating Mozart so much as approaching the notion of the Mozart industry and what he stood for. And I even now forgotten who the other composers were. But Louis Andriessen and myself decided to make something which we called M is for Man, Music and Mozart, which I know some of us have seen a couple of days ago, and maybe even before you saw it. As a result of that collaboration, it was suggested that Louis Andriessen and I should work on something new. Much, much earlier, way back in the 1970s, I had been deeply fascinated by the death of Anton Webern. Strange, mysterious death happening in Mitterskill in Austria during the years of the ending of the American occupation of Austria. One snowy night, it seems that Webern was celebrating a birthday of one of his grandchildren and got embroiled in some black marketeering associations with the American Army of Occupation. 3 shots ran out on a snowy night, and the man lay dying in the snow. He was dead 24 hours afterwards. A most peculiar and tragic and totally apparently accidental death, which killed off one of the major members of that Schoenberg-Berg-Webern trio, which set up so much exciting music at the beginning of the 20th century. There were lots of theories about his death because nobody could actually believe it was so peculiarly accidental. There were theories that he had recently converted his Judaism to Christianity, and this was a reprise activity by some very keen Zionists. There was a suggestion that departing Nazis had a particular axe to grind with somebody who subverted the German tradition of music, certainly to their ideas about banality and so on. That could very well be on the agenda. There was also a suggestion that somehow he'd been embroiled in an indictment of adultery, not with anything to do with him or his wife, who were incredibly devout, but in association with his rather wayward son-in-law. But it is interesting that the circumstances of the autopsy and the post-mortem and ultimately the declaration of his death, there were many, many questions. I looked at this death from many, many angles and wanted to make a documentary for the BBC about it, but I found that many other people had been there before, and also there was too much fiction. There was too much of the apocrypha to wish to make something that was, should we say, entirely factional. So I wanted to make something fictional. I began to examine the death and found there were a series of interesting clues. But this was also, I suppose, revised in my imagination in 1980. And in 1980, for those of you of my generation will know, it was the year of the death of John Lennon at the Dakota Hotel in New York. And I noticed that there were a remarkable number of clues that were present at the death of John Lennon, which were exactly the same clues that were present so much earlier at the death of Anton Webern. And an examination of a whole series of other strange composer deaths between 1945 and 1980 produced copycat murders with a series of strange circumstantial use of clues. In fact, in the end, I discovered there were 10 identical circumstantial pieces of evidence which united the deaths of all 10 composers. This obviously could not be an accident. There had to be a conspiracy here. Somebody was out to bump off composers. This became more and more entertaining, and also since it was very much to do with the notion of music, the best way to portray this would be musically, so create a piece of musical theatre. I pushed and pulled this project around for a long time, and it was growing and growing and growing. And in the end, I didn't want to make one musical piece of theatre about 10 composers, but we wanted in the end to make 10 pieces of musical theatre about 10 composers. I had so much information that I began to put it together into a very short novel form, and this, and I suppose, became particularly enthusiastically received by a man called Pierre Audi, who ran the opera house in Amsterdam. And he suggested that maybe it might be an idea to break the whole thing down into 10 separate areas, and he would consider the possibility of putting one of these operas on. Okay, all this information focusing down. Of these 10 operas, we finally ended up making an opera called Rosa, which was number 5 in the series. Rosa was a Uruguayan composer who died mysteriously in a desert whilst he was riding his horse. He had a very fulsome education in music in Europe and also at the Juilliard in New York, but his main ambition in life was to write music for musical westerns. And indeed, he did have a career which was quite profitable, and it certainly excited the interest of other composers antagonistically and competitively who were also writing music at that time. So there are possible people who might have been involved in his assassination. But also his Uruguayan parents, who owned a very profitable abattoir and meatpacking business in Uruguay, not far away from Fray Bentos. I always remember Fray Bentos as being an alternative to the word spam. I'm always sure you're all familiar with the word spam from Monty Python. But you either got your corned beef in cans marked Fray Bentos, or you got your corned beef in cans marked spam. Take your choice. His family were very much against the idea, as they saw it, that this man should slum his musical education by making such vulgarities in support of Hollywood westerns. So there's a lot of theories that he was also assassinated somewhere along the line, somewhere at the back, by members of his family. And he also had a very sadomasochistic relationship with an intended fiancée. It's also possible that her champions might also have been responsible in the background. I'm not going to say very much more about it, and I, again, make no apologies, because I'm going to present you with this as my talk for tonight. It's 90 minutes long, and if I speak much longer, you're going to be here for a long time. If you do enjoy it, and you are interested, of course I would be more than only too happy